Once a module's been defined, it's easy to add controllers and other AngularJS components into the module, and that's going to have several benefits, one of which is you're going to pull those functions, like we've done with our controller up to this point, out of the global scope, and we're going to be able to take advantage of some of the AngularJS, what I like to call machinery. So what I'm going to do in this section is walk you through several examples of defining controllers in a module. There's not just one way to do it, so I'll show you a few options there, and then you can kind of pick what you like best. Now, option number one is shown here, and what we're going to do is create our module. You can see we have one called demo app with no dependencies, and we're going to assign the object that is the result of that, which is the module, to our demo app variable. Now, demo app is actually in the global scope in this particular scenario, so that may be good or bad. You'd probably want to give it a very specific name if you're going to take this approach. But what we're going to do with it is once we have that module object, we can simply call .controller. So step one is we define our module. Step two is then we use that module object to define a controller. Now what we're going to do is simply give the controller a name, so we give it a string, and then the second parameter is going to be the actual controller functionality. So we have an anonymous function here, the scope is injected, and then we have the standard properties on our scope, and we can have functions and other things, of course. Now, the only downside of this approach, really, is that we do have this global variable here, and that may or may not be good for your scenario. It really depends. I personally try to avoid these global type of variables whenever possible, but that is one option. Now, option two is shown here. So what we're going to do is, in some file, we're going to go ahead and create our module, and this might not even be a global variable here. This could be wrapped in a little wrapper function like I'm going to show you in a moment. But what we're going to do when we create the controller in a separate file is after the module is defined, we're going to reference that module. And you'll notice a really big difference here. It's kind of subtle, but it's a really big difference. Up here, when you define a module, you have to give it the either empty array or a list of your dependencies. Well, if you just say angular.module and the name of the module, then it will simply reference that module in memory. Now, even if I got rid of this variable up here, I would still be able to reference the module using this technique. Then I can call .controller, give it a name, and then give it the functionality. So that's option number two for defining controllers. What I like to do is more along the lines of option three here. So I'll define my module, usually in my app.js file, and I try to avoid any global variables there. So you'll see we're going to refactor our code once we get to the demonstration here. And what I'm going to do is wrap this in a little anonymous function. In fact, you'll see an example of that right here. Now, when it comes to defining the controller, let's say that we're in a separate file here. We're going to come in, and what I like to do is focus on the JavaScript first. In other words, don't worry about all the Angular hoops that you need to jump through to get your controller into the module. Let's get the controller working properly first. So I like to just create a variable for my controller, assign that to my function, and then the rest is everything we've covered up to this point. Pretty standard. Then what I'll do is angular.module will reference the module again. Notice there's no square brackets here, so it's just a reference. And then I'll simply feed this variable, which is really a function, into the controller definition. Now, the other big thing here is you'll notice this variable right here, simple controller, is not in the global scope, and that's because we've done an anonymous function wrapper. And this function is self-invoked, so as soon as the script parser parses this, it's going to come in, call this function, which will then execute this, and then we'll assign that into our Angular controller. Now, that's the approach I like to take. Those are three different options, though. It really doesn't matter per se how you do it. I would be a little bit leery about global variables just because you don't want other scripts or other people on your team stepping on those accidentally. But there's your options, and you can certainly pick what you like. Now, the final piece of this, though, is what if you run this through a script minifier like uglify.js or one of the others out there to strip out comments, remove white space, shorten parameter and variable names, and those types of things. Well, if scope were to get shortened to, say, just S, and this becomes s.customers, that will break everything because Angular, when it does the dependency injection, it actually looks specifically for $scope. So if a script minifier were to change that just to try to shrink it up and, shrink down the script size, that would definitely cause a problem. So what do we do there? Well, there's actually a couple options. One option is when you actually define your controller here and give it a name, right before you give it either the object or the function for the controller functionality, you can put square brackets, and then in quotes, you would give a list of all the parameter names that would go here. So right now I only have one, which is scope. But what'll happen is if a script minifier renames this right here to say S, it won't matter because Angular will look at this and know that S really means $scope. So this is purely a script minification type of technique to prevent problems when we run our scripts through some of these production minification type of frameworks out there. Now you'll notice the square brackets for this ends right there. Now I know the first time I saw this I said, that gets a little messy, and it does, and this is just one option you can do. Now, the other option, which I actually like this option a little bit better, I think it's somewhat cleaner, is we go ahead and I'm going to use the technique I showed previously for option 3, and we define a controller. But before I actually hook that controller into the module, I say simple controller dot, and what I can do is say $inject. And what that will do is the same thing as up here, just in a different syntax. And then I would give a comma-separated list of all the parameter names. So if I had scope and comma HTTP, then this would be scope, comma, and then in quotes, HTTP, if that was the second parameter. Now again, doing this will prevent Angular from breaking the dependency injection where it just gives it to you kind of auto-magically, and it will make this work. So I'll show this a little more as we jump into the demonstration here.